Symposium, who looked after my accommodation and more. Also my thanks to Professor Cathy Munro, Chair of HASA. Their enthusiasm, as you've just heard from her, for promoting an interest in history is breathtaking. The focal point of my paper is the Middelburg peace discussions between the British, now let me just see, does that work? Yes, between the British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Kitchener, and the Commandant-General of the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, or Transvaal, General Louis Botha, on 28 February 1901. But these discussions should be placed in context, and the subtitle of the paper therefore reads, No, I don't want you there. I want to go back. Go back 3 spaces. Do not pass go, do not collect 200. From where to, what, and where to. Right, now I've got my, I know, President, hang on. Most of the discussions on peace were either amongst the Transvaal officers with President Kruger, no, that's not President Kruger, with President Kruger featuring as well, or between the governments of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Oh, look at this, wonderful. You people in Middelburg are really fantastic. I can see what you see, I can see there. So this is superb. Okay. So this is about the discussions and between the governments of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. In the case of the latter, between the governments of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the initiative, time and again, came from the Transvaalers. There were also overtures about peace coming from, Lord Roberts, Kitchener's predecessor as the British Commander-in-Chief, and Kitchener himself. So they all became involved in peace efforts. Only twice there were British peace proposals on the table, following from the Middelburg discussions of February 1901 and at Vereniging in May 1902. The first attempt to obtain peace was in early March 1900, when the Republican war effort was in disarray. On the Natal front, General Sir Redvers Buller had succeeded in breaking through the Boer line to relieve Ladysmith on 28 February after a siege of 4 months. The result was the collapse of the Boer front along the river, the Tugela River in Natal. And seeing that we've got extra time, I can divert from my... In 1972, I had an interview with old Oom Loot van der Merwe in Lindley. And I was on the track of General de Wet during the first hunt 72 years before. And I was told, go and see Oom Loot in Lindley, because he was with de Wet on that specific, when they were chased. And the appointment was for 9 o'clock in the morning, and he came in dressed in khaki, barefoot. And he was 92 or 93. And his daughter-in-law, somewhere in the 60s, early 60s. But he was basically deaf. So he sat down and she stood at his shoulder to shout in his ear what I was asking. And I wanted to know about de Wet's escape over Slubbert's Neck from the Brontwater Basin. So I said, tell me about the escape over Slubbert's Neck. So I'm going to say this in Afrikaans, I hope you understood. And he shouted because she said, vertel van generaal de Wet se ontsnapping oor Slabbert's nek. So he got that. He said, ja, toe trek ons oor Slabbert's nek. Maar by Lady Smith het ons vir 4 maande gelê en niks doen nie. Ek sê, no, I want about Slabbert's nek. Hy sê, yes, toe trek ons oor Slabbert's nek. Maar by Lady Smith het ons vir 4 maande gelê en niks doen nie. And I couldn't get Oom Loot van der Merwe away from the siege of Lady Smith. I wanted to know more about that terrific escape over Slabbert's Neck on 15 July 1900. I never got to that from poor Oom Loot. So, on the Western Front, General Piet Cronje surrendered with 4,000 men at Paardeberg on 27 February 1900, introducing the collapse of that sector. With Roberts heading from Paardeberg along the Modder River towards Bloemfontein, the Free State capital, the Boer commanders on the southern front near Colesberg were in danger of being cut off, and they consequently retreated through the eastern Free State. Under these circumstances, President Kruger of the Transvaal and the President of Free State, M.T. Steyn, decided to send a telegram to the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, requesting an end to the war, by which they would retain their independence. A week later, Salisbury ended his lengthy response with the words, "Her Majesty's government are not prepared to assent to the independence either of the South African Republic or the Orange Free State." The British conviction was that the Boer republics should be defeated properly. Otherwise, there would be another war soon, like the present war proved to be a follow-up of the War of 1880-1881. Thereupon, the Boer government sent a deputation of 3 men under... No, come on, General. You see. You can see why I didn't study engineering, eh? And I studied law for 3 weeks, and then I realized I can't lie, so I went to history. And now, Abraham Fisher was the leader of this 3-man deputation to Europe to obtain intervention, and therefore peace. However, the deputation failed in its mission. Not one of the powers was prepared to arouse the displeasure of Big Brother Britain. With Roberts advancing on Pretoria and occupying Johannesburg on 31 May, the Transvaal leadership fluctuated heavily in their mood for continuing or ending the war. In the early evening of 31 May, several prominent Boer officers, including General Louis Botha and... No, I'll get it right by the end of my lecture. And Ben Viljoen informed Kruger it was time to concede defeat. Pretoria could not hold out against the British, and to defend it would lead to severe loss of life and terrible devastation. Kruger was dismayed and immediately communicated these views to Steyn. He added that most of the officers and burghers were unwilling to continue the struggle and had gone home. Only the powerful response of Steyn and General Christian de Wet on the 1st of June prevented peace. I would like you to think about this issue. Would it have been a good thing to accept peace, sue for peace at that stage, or not? I think we're going to have a lot of time so we can discuss that. But Steyn did not mince his words to Kruger. Ending the war would mean a death blow to the Afrikaner cause. He pointed out that the Free State burghers had sunk into the same discouragement after the fall of Bloemfontein, but that they had overcome that. If Kruger and the Transvaal officers were determined to continue, the Transvaal burghers would take courage again. In a telegram to Botha, de Wet echoed Steyn's words. This is what General Jan... Come on. Aha. This is what General Jan Smuts had to say shortly after the war about Steyn's response to Kruger, where Steyn said, "No worries, you cannot accept peace now." He wrote, his answer meant 2 years more of war, and this is Smuts' words, the utter destruction of both republics, losses in life and treasure, compared with which the appalling losses of the preceding 8 months were to dwindle into utter significance. But it meant also that every Boer that was to survive the death struggle, every child to be born in South Africa, was to have a prouder self-respect and a more erect carriage before the nations of the world. Later, on the same morning, the 1st of June, there was a full council of 43 Transvaal officers under Botha in the chamber of the Second Volksraad in the government building on Church Square. They were not aware of Botha and Kruger's falter of the previous evening. When General Tobias Smuts hinted in the direction of peace, Captain Dani Tron accused peace talkers as traitors. Eventually, the Council of War decided by 29 votes to 14, to leave matters in the hands of Botha. It seems that the reaction by Steyn and de Wet inspired Botha and gave him renewed courage, because on the same day he confirmed his resolve to fight as long as he could assemble a commando. A Boer surrender at this stage would obviously, now basically answering my question of earlier, a Boer surrender at this stage would obviously have meant the loss of independence. And like in European wars where the capital had been taken by the enemy, the peace proposals would have been crushing for the Boer cause, with amongst other conditions, economic reparations, for instance, more strict measures, and a bleak prospect for an early responsible or self-government. Directly after the fall of Pretoria, on 5 June 1900, but can you recognize where we are now at this photograph? The hill on the left at the background is where UNISA stands now. And in front, to their left, our right, is the Pretoria station. Okay, have you got that? Good. Although the initiative, directly after the fall of Pretoria on 5 June, Botha was approached a number of times on the matter of seeking peace. Although the initiatives did not come from Roberts himself, he eagerly made use of these civilian mediators. It seems that they wanted both parties to believe that the other party desired contact. These mediators included Louis de Souza, the Secretary of the Transvaal's Department of the Commandant General, J.S. Smit, Commissioner of Railways, J.F. de Beer, Chief Inspector of Officers of the Transvaal, and Mrs. Annie Botha, the wife of the Commandant General herself. On 12 June, the second day of the Battle of Diamond Hill, Roberts formally made a peace offer to Botha. Botha's answer was that he would seriously consider it and requested an armistice to consult his officers and his government. Roberts was not prepared to agree on an armistice, whereupon Botha broke down the negotiations. An interesting point. What would these proposals have been, and what would have been the future if Roberts had said, okay, armistice, talk to your men? Let us make a quick assessment of Botha's attitude to peace between the end of May 1900 and the middle of June 1900, 2-3 weeks. Leopold Scholz is of the opinion, my dear friend has passed away, so perhaps he's still of the opinion, that Botha was not a steadfast person and that he lacked moral courage. I think it more probable that in this case and in all other cases where Botha was to be involved in peace discussions, he was in favor of peace, but not at all cost, and definitely not supporting surrender unconditionally. Distinguish between a negotiated peace, where you talk about what will you accept, what will I accept, and surrendering unconditionally. That is a very harsh one, because then you have no say in what the terms were. Up to this point, peace or no peace was the issue at stake, and conditions for peace were not even thought of. At the end of August 1900, Steyn, with his Free State government, joined Kruger at Waterval onder. This was just over 2 weeks before Steyn visited him. This photograph was taken. Do you know where this is? Krugerhof. Just when you've gone through from Waterval Boven, past the tunnel, down to Waterval onder, on the right-hand side, there's a beautiful little house, Krugerhof, where he stayed. So, Botha, who had just been driven off at Bergendal or Delmenhutha, proposed to Kruger that although he had stood firm up to that point, they should make use of Steyn's presence to bring this matter to an end. He added that it was not out of cowardice, but because of the circumstances, and that General Ben-Viljoen was of the same opinion. Botha explained to Steyn that he didn't. This was a telephone conversation, a draadgesprek. He explained to Steyn that he did not want to end the war during his retreat. He wanted to dig in his heels and only then negotiate. As the responsible Commandant General, he was ready for peace, but not at all cost. A more powerful position, he felt, could ensure better terms. At a joint meeting of the two Republican governments on 28 August, the next day, it was decided unanimously, after some, quote, unpleasant discussions, end of quote, that negotiations about peace were out of the question. This was not the first and would not be the last time that the republics decided to continue the war, evidently because of Stein's unyielding stance. The meeting decided to send Kruger to Europe to further the Boer cause there, because that deputation of Fischer was not successful. But his age prevented him from remaining with the burghers in the field. He was almost 75, corpulent, and there was going to be a guerrilla war, and the mobility of that would not fit in with this old man's pace. And furthermore, if he were caught, it would mean the end of the war. So, Schalkburger was appointed acting president. With Kruger on his way to Europe, and a vacillating, thanks for the colour, Tinus Leroux, and a vacillating acting president, a vice president in Schalkburger at the head of the government, from September 1900, Botha, who as Commandant General was a member of the Executive Council, therefore the government, almost seamlessly was in control of the Transvaal politics as well, Botha, and not Vice President Burger. A situation that in effect had developed after the fall of Pretoria in June 1900. Between September 1900 and February 1901, Botha was again placed under enormous pressure to end the war. Roberts personally sent him at least 5 letters pointing out the hopelessness of the Boer cause and advising him to end the struggle. Botha declined these invitations. He also rejected with contempt the attempts by individuals, amongst others, by businessman Sammy Marks, whereby Roberts and then Kitchener were involved. It was also painful to Botha when in January 1901, Kitchener sent the aged former president M.W. Pretorius to influence Botha for peace. Humiliating, too, was a letter in January 1901 from the Burger Peace Committee, which had been raised by Kitchener from prominent burghers who had laid down their arms and had started to collaborate with the British authorities. So from handsoppers, they became joiners or collaborators. For them, Botha's message was, and I quote, "It is impossible for me to negotiate with traitors, and I can even say murderers of their people." End of quote. Clearly gleaning from his intelligence sources that Botha was more disposed to peace negotiations than his fellow Transvaal generals, and aware of the relentlessness of Steyn and de Wet, Kitchener invited Botha for peace talks. There's a lovely wimpy at Middelburg. No, he didn't say that. It was a verbal message, again with Annie Botha as the mediator, who arrived at Botha's headquarters on 13 February 1901. The one condition was that the question of independence of, quote, the Transvaal and Orange River Colony, because they had annexed these two already, was not to be discussed. Independence was not to be discussed. Botha accepted the invitation, suggesting Middelburg as a meeting place, and adding that nobody desired peace more than he did. But what about the Free State government? From the outset, there had been an agreement between Kruger and Steyn that neither of the two governments would accept peace or open negotiations with the British without permission of the other. Botha informed Steyn and de Wet of his intended meeting with Kitchener. He didn't say, may I do that? Do you think I should do that? He said, I'm going to do this. Acting President Schalkburger also gave notice to Steyn, adding that it could do no harm to find out the British attitude, without the Boers committing themselves. It did do harm. Botha had accepted Kitchener's invitation before the Transvaal leaders informed their Free State allies. It was the thin end of the wedge that had appeared. But of course, at that moment, Steyn and de Wet were being chased in the third de Wet hunt and incapable of interference. And Kitchener seized the opportunity to effect a settlement with Botha. On 28 February 1901, Kitchener and Botha met at Middelburg at the residence Highbury Hall of the Labour family. My thanks to Thu Lichthelm for this photograph, the first time it is used, and it is also there at the back. According to the Times history of the war in South Africa, in spite of the express condition laid down by Kitchener that independence was not to be discussed, according to the Times history, Botha began by asking that the republics should retain some sort of independence. However, the minutes by N.J. de Wet, Botha's military secretary, differ from this. De Wet is in the front row on the left-hand side next to Botha. His minutes differ from what the Times history says. According to N.J. de Wet, it was Kitchener who began by stating that the British government had sent word that the Boers could not retain their independence. Thereupon, Botha indicated, according to N.J. de Wet, that the Boers could still hold out for a lengthy period, and that he reckoned that the Boer governments would not accept peace without independence. Kitchener afterwards reported to the Secretary of State, St. John Broderick, that Botha, quote, tried very hard for some kind of independence, end of quote. Kitchener repeated that he regarded independence as out of the question, and that any form of independence would be dangerous and would lead to another war. What he could say was that the Boers would rule the former republics with an executive council, and that they would be able to elect their own council. These words by Kitchener were misleading because they meant immediate self-government or responsible government, and self-government in British colonial policy was only the ultimate goal in a long process. At the end of the discussion, which reportedly was conducted in a very friendly and reasonable spirit, according to the Times history, Botha departed with a letter containing terms of a peace proposal. The letter was also sent to the British government via Lord Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa. The terms were confirmed by the British government with some modifications, and on 7 March 1901, Botha received the response of the British government, which included some modification of the draft. Let's have a look at that. The most important point was that the republics were to lose their independence and become British colonies, and that all inhabitants were to sign the oath of allegiance and become British subjects. Secondly, at the earliest practical date, military administration would be replaced by civil administration in the form of crown colony government and, as soon as circumstances permit, representative government would be introduced and ultimately self-government or responsible government. Thirdly, both the English and Dutch language would be used and taught in public schools when the parents of the children desire it. Fourthly, £1,000,000 would be set aside as compensation for goods commandeered by the late Republican governments or commandants. The new government would assist the occupants of farms to repair any injury sustained by destruction of building or loss of stock during the war. They didn't say how they would do that. Fifthly, the franchise would not be given to black men in the new colonies before representative government was granted to these colonies, and if then given, it would be so limited as to secure the just predominance of the white race. And six, according to the laws passed in the colonies during the war, Cape and Natal rebels would lose their franchise, the vote, for life. For the first time, Botha had the opportunity to learn the British viewpoint on peace and could decide accordingly whether peace was an option or not. Although he dominated the Transvaal government by this time, he did not want to decide on peace on his own. He therefore corresponded with General Koos de la Rey in the Western Transvaal, but met with no encouragement to be positive about the proposals. For the Transvaal government too, the conditions were totally unacceptable. I see the hand of State Secretary F.W. Reitz there, and not Skalkburger. Thereupon, Botha informed Kitchener on 16 March that he and his chief officers in government were in complete agreement that the conditions were unacceptable. He was probably influenced by the notion that the Free State government was dead against peace without independence. Mistrusting their Transvaal allies, the Free State government demanded a meeting with the Transvaal government and the generals De Wet and Botha. On 15 April, the issue of peace was discussed at Klip River in the Vrede district. It was decided unanimously to continue the struggle. As before, and in cases hereafter, unanimously clearly meant that a minority gave way for the sake of a united front. Botha's viewpoint is not known. There wasn't, minutes were not taken. In May and June 1901, Transvaal leaders again discussed peace, this time on their own, again, at the Farm de Emigratie in the Ermelo district. On 10 May 1901, the Transvaal government and Generals Louis Botha, Ben Viljoen, Jan Smuts, and Chris Botha decided to request Kitchener to allow that 2 delegates be sent to Kruger in the Netherlands to discuss the war situation and inquire about the diplomatic intervention from Europe. At the same time, they sent a letter in a very pessimistic tone to the Free State government. Remember this? The letter was in a very pessimistic tone to the Free State government, in which they mentioned their contact with Kitchener and informed them that a continuation of the struggle had become impossible. This now was 10 May 1901. In his reply, Steyn was highly indignant. It was barely a month after they had decided solemnly to continue the struggle. Nothing had happened in the meantime that could justify the tone of the letter. He also disapproved of the request to Kitchener because thereby they had exposed their hand to the enemy. Now, of course, by then, Botha knew everything about exposing your hand because here at Middelburg he was taught to play bridge by Kitchener. A bridge too far or a bridge too cross, we don't know. Nonetheless, the Transvaal government went ahead. Kitchener was not prepared to allow the delegate through to Kruger, but instead granted Smuts permission on the 3rd of June to send a message in code via the Dutch consul in the Transvaal. In his message to Kruger, Smuts indicated that their cause was, and I quote, in a truly fearful position. By the way, it was decoded by the British, to read, in a truly fearful position. Aha! I mean, aha. He supplied grim detail, remarking that the republics had become a wasteland. In conclusion, he requested some advice from Kruger as to what they should do. Well, of course, one of the things Kruger advised was read the Old Testament. And it is a joke, but it's quite true, by the way. The Transvaal government received Kruger's reaction on 13 June. He indicated that diplomatic intervention in Europe was not going to happen. Nevertheless, he expressed the hope that the republics would persevere, except if it was absolutely impossible to continue. In his memoirs, Steyn expresses his disappointment about the negative content of the message to Kruger. He realized he had to intervene again. At the new meeting of the Republican governments and main officers at Waterval River in the Standerton district on 19 and 20 June 1901, though, he was surprised to find that the general sentiment was that the war should be continued forcefully. It was particularly the victories of General Jan Kemp at Vlakfontein on 29 May and General Chris Muller at Wilmansrust on 12 June near Bethal and Kruger's plea for perseverance that lifted spirits. Minutes of the meeting at Waterval do not exist, but it appears that the decision to continue the war was a majority decision. This is what we learn from a letter by Ben Viljoen to Botha in February 1902, where he mentions that the two of them were of the opinion at Waterval that they should try and get an honorable peace. Then Kitchener had a stroke of luck. Remember that pessimistic letter of 10 May 1901 sent to Steyn? Kitchener had a stroke of luck. On the 11th of July 1901, a British column surprised the Free State government in the town of Reitz. Steyn managed to escape, but his entire government was taken prisoner, and a new government was appointed from the top officers. the government papers fell into British hands, including the damning correspondence, not damn correspondence, but damning correspondence with the Transvaal government of May 1901. Kitchener had this printed and distributed among the Boers in the field to show that your leaders are not going to make it. You'd better come in and surrender. But eventually, the war was to come to a close. The first move was a note from the Dutch Prime Minister, Dr. Abraham Kuyper, to the British government on 25 January 1902, knowing very well that 47 years later I was going to be born, offering his government service as mediator for an interchange of thoughts on peace. Salisbury replied, no, we cannot do anything about that, but Kitchener sent copies of the correspondence to the Transvaal government. It is noteworthy that Kitchener sent the correspondence only to Burger and not to Steyn as well. In his memoirs, Steyn is correct in his opinion that Kitchener purposefully had overlooked him and rather had made contact with the leaders who in the past had been inclined to negotiate about peace. The Boer governments, assisted by Generals Botha, De Wet and De la Rey, met at Klerksdorp between 9 and 11 April 1902, where they supported the preservation of the independence of the republics. Between 12 and 17 April, the Boer government negotiated with Kitchener at his headquarters, Melrose House in Pretoria. They were joined 2 days later, on 14 April, by Milner. Milner and Kitchener did not see eye to eye about the subjection of the republics. Milner desired a total military subjection. The war had to go on until all of the Boer leaders had been captured. Otherwise, the Boers would still regard them as their political leaders after the war. But Kitchener wanted a speedy end to the war to be available for the appointment as Commander-in-Chief in India. He didn't want to carry on. Following from these discussions, 60 delegates, 30 from each republic, met at Vereniging on 15 May 1902, where the conditions in the two republics were put under scrutiny between 15 and 17 May, and again between 29 and 31 May. Most delegates declared that conditions were pitiful in their districts, but that there was still hope enough to continue the war. On 17 May, a commission consisting of Botha, De Wet, De la Rey, J.B.M. Hertzog, and Jan Smuts was delegated to negotiate with Kitchener in Pretoria about peace and to submit any decision to the delegates at Vereniging for approval. So it's Botha, De Wet, De la Rey, Hertzog, and Smuts. 2 lawyers. Hertzog had a doctor's degree from the University of Amsterdam, and Jan Smuts matriculated at the age of 12. But you know a bit more, he went on a bit more than that, didn't he? Okay. Now, for the next 10 days, from 19 to 28 May, the discussions shifted to Melrose House. Now, Jan Smuts is probably one of the most intelligent South Africans ever born. Milner, Kitchener, Hertzog and Smuts formed a subcommittee to construct a draft for discussion. So now it's two lawyers against one politician and one military man. Who's going to win here? It was in essence the Middelburg proposals that emerged on 21 May. Smuts and Herzog, listen to this, did, however, succeed in assuring that the Boer leaders would sign the final peace treaty as governments of, respectively, the Transvaal or Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek and the Orange Free State, and not as the Transvaal and Orange River Colony, thus ensuring that Britain's annexations of the republics during the war were not recognized. A week later, on 28 May, the response of the British government arrived. Remember, they sent basically the Middelburg peace proposals to London. The Boer delegates at Vereniging had to accept or reject these proposals by the evening of 31 May with merely a yes or a no. The most important clauses were: the burger forces in the field would lay down their arms and recognize His Majesty King Edward VII as their lawful sovereign. Burghers in the field and in prisoner of war camps who accepted their position as subjects of His Majesty King Edward would be brought back to their homes. Thirdly, these burghers would not be deprived of their personal liberty or property. Fourth, the Dutch language would be taught in public schools where the parents desired it and would be allowed in courts of law. Number 5, representative government and eventually responsible government or self-government would be introduced as soon as circumstances permitted. 6, the question of granting the franchise to black people, take note of the wording here, the question of granting the franchise to black people would not be decided until after the introduction of self-government. And seventhly, £3 million sterling would be made available to support the repatriated and the needy, and to pay receipts given by the Boer officers in the field. In a separate statement, it was declared that Cape and Natal rebels were to lose the franchise for 5 years. In conclusion, the important question is, how did the Middelburg peace proposals of February 1901 compare with these of the final peace proposals? In the first place, both were British proposals for a negotiated peace, not a pistol against the head. Negotiated peace, they'd been discussing that at Melrose House for some days, and this peace with loss of independence. But there were no economic punitive measures as were going to happen after the First and the Second World War for the German reparations. This was a huge concession by the British government. But what were the differences? In the first place, it is noteworthy that the amount of £1 million sterling that the British government would provide to the former republics at Middelburg was raised to £3 million. However, despite the fact that additional loans were to be granted, there is a huge but, with one T, but attached to this improvement. The destruction of 30,000 homesteads, which Chamberlain accepted as a figure, 30,000 homesteads, and the loss of livestock caused by the scorched earth policy between February 1901 and May 1902 were much more devastating and costly than in the period before February 1901. Eventually, the claims were to exceed vastly the available funds, with 39,000 approved claims totaling £70 million. On average, a Boer bitter ender or a prisoner of war was paid out £25 for his claim and 2 shillings in the pound for a claim beyond the £25. Hans Opperst, who signed the oath of neutrality, got 10 shillings in the pound. Secondly, at Middelburg, the franchise would not be given to black men in the new colonies before representative government was granted to these colonies. With Vereniging, it was stipulated, an entry for which Smuts was responsible, that the question of granting the franchise to black people would not be decided until after the introduction of self-government. This meant that the issue could be raised after the introduction of self-government, but need not necessarily be approved. And so this was effectively postponed with the granting of self-government in 1906, again at the forming of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and the coming of the Republic of South Africa in 1961, until 27 April 1994. Thirdly, at Middelburg, both the English and Dutch languages would be used and taught in public schools, when the parents of the children desired it. At Vereniging, the Dutch language would be taught in public schools where the parents desired it, but the language of instruction would only be English. For the Boers, this was clearly a weakening of the Middelburg proposal, because there they could learn and teach and read. They could learn Dutch and they could speak Dutch. At Vereniging, the method of instruction was only English. It is doubtful, however, if the Middelburg proposal of Dutch being allowed to be spoken would have survived Milner's policy of Anglicization after the war. Finally, at Middelburg, Cape and Natal rebels would have lost their franchise permanently. At Vereniging, it was only to be lost for 5 years. But it did give Dr. Leander Starr Jamison the opportunity in 1905 to come to power, just before the rebels were allowed to vote again. My last sentence or two. I do not need to tell you that the 60 Boer delegates at Vereniging voted 54 and 6 against the British peace proposals, and that the Peace of Vereniging was signed on Saturday evening, the 31st of May 1902, which ended Republican independence. Thank you for your time.